Incoming. 4 o'clock low, 2 more high. Get down, get down. Tracer rounds ripped through the sky, carving burning arcs across the cockpit glass. The fortress shuddered as the tail section took a direct hit. Warning lights flared. The number 4 engine spat oil. Inside the belly turret, Corporal Evans screamed, "I've lost traverse, I'm stuck." No one could help. Everyone was busy bracing for death. Captain Frank Keller didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He rolled the yoke hard, dragging 30 tons of mangled bomber into a steep bank that no B-17 was supposed to survive. Instruments spun. The crew screamed. What the hell is he doing outside? 14 Focke-Wulf FW-190s swarmed like hornets. They weren't strafing, they were finishing. Coming in fast from 3 vectors. Keller knew this pattern. They'd used it over Bari, over Split. You don't dodge it, you die in it, unless he pulled harder. The plane tipped past 45 degrees. The left waist gunner slipped, slammed into the fuselage wall. Oxygen mask yanked sideways. Somewhere above the chaos. The fortress's side-mounted 50 cals meant for separate arcs suddenly overlapped. 2 gunners opened fire at once, and the sky screamed back. One FW-190 banked too late caught the merged stream of lead head-on. It exploded mid-roll. Another clipped its wingman as it tried to break. The formation staggered, twisted, broke apart. Confusion bloomed. Keller held the bank. Not to turn, to trap. The fortress wasn't climbing, wasn't diving. It was hanging at a blade angle, half falling, half stalling just enough to align the entire ship's firepower like a rotating saw. One move, one moment. Against 14. He was supposed to keep it level. He was supposed to follow formation rules. He was supposed to protect his crew by the book. But Keller didn't believe in the book. He believed in the edge, and he had just dragged an entire German kill formation into it. Frank Keller was the name that got passed around with a smirk in flight briefings. His call sign came with a pause. Not out of respect, but because no one wanted to be assigned to his element. He wasn't reckless. He was worse. He was unpredictable. On one mission over Vienna, he broke formation to chase a fighter, pulling wide on their 9 o'clock. Scored a kill, but the rest of the squadron had to adjust spacing mid-run. His group commander called it tactical ego. Another pilot called it Keller math, whatever numbers he was flying by. No one else could solve them. They didn't call him a hero. They called him a habit. The kind of habit that gets people killed. His reputation wasn't born from medals, it was born from maneuvers that B-17s weren't built to make. During a training sortie, he once banked 50 degrees on final to demonstrate aggressive rudder discipline to a co-pilot. That co-pilot later asked for reassignment. Not because Keller was cruel, but because he flew like the rules hadn't been written for him. In the officer's mess, the jokes came easy. Captain Bank Angle, the rollover reverend, that guy who thinks bombers are fighters. Keller heard them. He didn't flinch. He never argued. He simply nodded and walked out of the room before the laughter got loud enough to sting. What could he say? They were right. He didn't fly like a fortress pilot. He flew like he was daring the air to answer back. One crew chief once said Keller's not brave. He's just somewhere else when he flies. Like he sees shapes we don't. That stuck. It became legend among rookies. Don't follow Keller unless you're ready to lose your bearings. The truth was simpler. Keller had spent his first 6 months in theater watching B-17s go down one by one. Not from incompetence, not from fear, from predictability, from flying straight when they should have turned, from holding formation when they should have scattered, from following procedures that were never written for chaos. So he mocked the manual by surviving, and they mocked him because they didn't know how else to explain a man who broke the rules and still came back breathing. The B-17 flying fortress wasn't built for what Frank Keller made it do. It was engineered for altitude, formation, and volume. 4 Wright R-1820 engines, each pushing 1,200 horsepower, gave it the lift to carry bombs over enemy territory and the strength to absorb punishment on the way out. But it wasn't nimble. It wasn't quick. It was a castle with wings, not a sword. In clean configuration, it could top out around 290 miles in level flight, but at combat load, damage on 2 engines, and altitude thinning its thrust, Red Willow 9 was closer to 180 and bleeding speed by the minute. Its turn radius under full power was wider than a football field. Its roll rate was glacial 8 to 12 seconds, for a full bank under normal trim. You didn't maneuver a fortress. You steered it. You let altitude and firepower do the fighting. That was the doctrine. Stay in box formation. Overlap fields of fire. Protect the group by sacrificing mobility for mutual cover. But all of that depended on one thing, cohesion. And cohesion was gone. Red Willow 9 was alone. 2 engines out, elevators strained, right rudder almost locked, 1 waist gun jammed. The tail gun wouldn't track. Trim tabs were out of balance, so every input bled energy. There was no speed to climb, no altitude left to trade, and no nearby bombers to shield her sides. She wasn't a flying fortress anymore. She was a target hanging in geometry. Her crew knew it. Every vibration was a countdown. Every flicker on the oil pressure gauge a warning. And they were trained to understand if fighters approached from multiple angles, and you lacked group coverage, your options became math problems with no answers. The best defense the B-17 had was overlapping 50 caliber arcs, but with the tail gun frozen and top turret dead, Keller was holding a broken wheel. His only advantage left wasn't speed or firepower, it was shape, volume, mass, and maybe, just maybe, gravity. You couldn't outmaneuver a fighter, but you could make them think they were chasing something predictable and then turn that shape into something ugly, something they didn't train for, something that shouldn't even be possible in a plane this size, until it was. The trap didn't start in the sky. It started in the numbers. 14 enemy fighters, 3 attack vectors, 2 engines out, 1 fortress alone. Every second shaved off their distance by almost 300 meters. At their current closing speed, Keller had less than 20 seconds before the first FW-190 opened fire. The classic German killbox formation split into 3 claws. 1 claw at 12 o'clock high to blind the nose gunner, 1 at 4 o'clock low to rake the belly, 1 wrapping from 7 to chew into the tail. It was geometry with fangs. And against the standard B-17, it almost always worked. But Keller wasn't standard. He wasn't thinking in guns. He was thinking in arcs. Every 50 caliber gun on a B-17 had a firing arc defined by elevation, traverse, and blind spots. Normally, these arcs overlapped when flying level, giving complete coverage only if the bomber held formation. But in isolation, those arcs fell apart. Blind spots multiplied. What Keller saw wasn't his guns failing. He saw an opportunity to combine their reach differently, not by aiming, but by tilting the entire aircraft. If he rolled the B-17 far enough, the left and right waist guns normally aimed outboard would now begin to overlap the forward sky. And if he held the bank steady, not correcting the yaw, he could actually maintain a moving wall of fire. Not accurate, not elegant, but dense enough to confuse an attacker's approach timing. It wasn't a turn. It wasn't a dive. It was a side slip into chaos. There was a catch. The fortress couldn't sustain more than 30 degrees of bank without structural stress. Over 45, you risked stall, drag spiral, and loss of internal stability. Bomb racks could shift, wings could flex, rudder control degraded. And if the elevator caught slipstream imbalance during yaw, you'd enter a roll you couldn't recover from. But Keller had already lost most of those systems. He wasn't risking control. He'd already lost it, which meant all he had left to lose was the enemy's rhythm. And if he broke that rhythm just for 5 seconds, he could turn their perfect geometry into shattered math. He didn't need agility. He just needed the angles to lie. The first hit wasn't a warning. It was a statement. A 20mm cannon shell slammed into the nose, shattering the perspex and spraying shrapnel through the bombardier's compartment. Lieutenant Kersey took a fragment to the jaw and dropped without a sound. Blood pooled against the drift site. The interphone exploded with overlapping shouts. The nose gunner leaned over the body, checked for breath, shook his head once, then he returned to the gun silent. The second hit tore through the number 2 engine cowling. Flames flickered, caught, then vanished as the prop spun down and seized. The engine was gone. Inside the cockpit. Keller checked his instruments. The vibrations told him more than the needles. The yoke pulled left with irregular force. The right rudder pedal had gone soft. Elevator trim was drifting without input. Something in the tail assembly had cracked. Maybe multiple things. The Fortress wasn't flying. It was holding on by memory. He tried a shallow bank right to test control just 10 degrees. The airframe bucked. Metal groaned. The inner wing flexed unnaturally. Keller leveled out and breathed through clenched teeth. His co-pilot shouted, "We've got to drop altitude now." "She won't hold," Keller didn't answer. He knew the numbers. At this altitude, a dive would make them sitting ducks. At lower altitude, the fighters would own the sky. No friendly cover, no cloud, no time. In the waist section, one gunner vomited again, this time from the G-forces. The other was trying to clear a jam with shaking hands. The smell of cordite mixed with oil and blood. The intercom crackled. Tails not responding. "I can't see the bastards behind us." Then static. Keller stared at the slip indicator. It was no longer a gauge, it was a question. Everything he was trained to do said level out. Descend, minimize profile. But the next wave of attackers was already repositioning. They were assuming their prey would fly straight. That's when Keller made the call. No more tests, no more corrections. He would fly the Fortress like it was already dead, because anything less would get them all killed, and that meant doing what no one ever trained for. Every pilot who sat in the left seat of a B-17 knew the rule: never roll past 30 degrees. Not in combat, not in formation, not in dive recovery. The Fortress wasn't built for it. She wasn't a fighter. Her wingspan was too wide, her mass too stubborn. The control surfaces responded like arguments, not answers. Anything past 30 was asking for structural failure, and everyone had heard the story of the crew that tried to bank away from a dive and snapped their left wing clean off. 8 dead. No survivors. That's why the manuals were clear. You don't roll a Fortress. You endure with her. But Frank Keller didn't care about the manuals. He was looking at vectors. He was watching how the FW-190s positioned their approach. He saw them split high, low, and level. He saw the staggered timing in their wings. He wasn't counting aircraft. He was counting seconds. 5 to impact from the high intercept. 7 from low. 4 from the frontal charge. He had no cover. No climb left. No speed. No tail gun. His only weapon was the empty air around him, and what he could do to shape it. The idea came like a whisper through metal. Not a tactic, a shape. If he rolled far enough, deeper than the engineers dared, he could collapse the gun arcs into a wedge. He'd create a triangle of fire, convergence, by tilting the whole aircraft sideways. It wouldn't be perfect. It would be ugly, uneven, but it would block the entry vectors long enough to scramble their rhythm. The gunners wouldn't have to aim. They'd just have to fire across the angles and trust gravity to keep them alive. There was no training for this. No drills, no orders. Only a gut feeling that the enemy's timing could be broken if they lost their formation rhythm. Keller understood something most didn't. Geometry doesn't care about fear. It only cares about shape. And he was about to reshape the sky. He called out no warning. He said nothing to his crew, because if he did, they'd try to stop him. Instead, he took the yoke, tightened the harness, and rolled the Fortress into the forbidden angle. The moment Keller rolled the yoke beyond 50 degrees, the Fortress protested with a scream of airframe tension. The sound was deep, primal aluminum against gravity, design against instinct. The left wing dipped hard, dragging the aircraft into a tilted descent that flirted with stall. His co-pilot shouted something unintelligible and reached for the controls. Keller slapped his hand away without breaking focus. He wasn't correcting. He was committing. The B-17 was now flying like a blade turned sideways. Fuel sloshed. Ammo belts clinked in panic. Crewmen shouted across the fuselage, "We're flipping! He's flipping us!" The left waist gunner lost his footing and slammed into the bulkhead. The tail gunner, still unconscious, shifted violently against his harness. Everything in the aircraft was screaming for balance, for level flight, for the safety of predictable behavior. But outside the plane, something else was happening. As the Fortress rolled, the geometry of her gun arcs changed. The left and right waist guns, which normally fired straight outboard, now angled upward into the same patch of sky. The top turret, limited in traverse, found its coverage overlapping with both, and all of it aimed straight into the kill path of the inbound attackers. The first FW-190 came in fast, confident. He didn't see the change until it was too late. A full stream of .50 caliber tracers tore through his fuselage. He burst into flame and disintegrated mid-roll. His wingman, momentarily blinded by the explosion, pulled hard right and clipped his own squadron mate. Both veered off in a spin. The high attack claw was gone. Next came the low approach. 4 fighters, disciplined, staggered. They expected belly fire, maybe a desperate nose gunner. Instead, they flew directly into a rising wall of crisscrossing tracers. The Fortress wasn't firing randomly. It was spinning a cone of death. 1 German peeled off immediately. 2 tried to adjust their climb angle, but in doing so, they exposed their bellies. The right waist gunner hit 1 square in the engine. It vented smoke and vanished. The 3rd pilot broke off and began spiraling upward, trying to reposition, but now his timing was off. The rhythm was gone. The frontal group hesitated. What had been perfect choreography turned into chaos. They'd trained for speed, for numbers, for coordination. Not for this. Not for a lumbering bomber that suddenly fought like a turreted tornado. Was Machter? Someone shouted in panic over German comms. Another barked, "Das ist unmöglich." The lead pilot tried to rally, pushed forward, but as he dove, he saw the gunners realigning again. He pulled up just in time to miss a burst that could have cleaved his cockpit in half. Inside Red Willow 9, the crew wasn't cheering. They weren't sure what was happening. They didn't know they'd just destroyed 3 fighters in under a minute. They only knew their pilot had rolled the aircraft into an unnatural position and refused to let go. The left engine coughed. Oil pressure dipped. Keller didn't flinch. He adjusted trim with brute force, holding the bank steady, dragging the entire aircraft through the air like it was scraping the inside of a turn no bomber should survive. Then it happened. The sky cleared. Not literally, but emotionally. The remaining fighters, disoriented, scattered. No more formation, no more timing. They weren't attacking. They were repositioning, buying time, recalculating, because the target wasn't flying like prey anymore. It was flying like a snare, and they had just flown straight into it. The FW-190 formation was trained for rhythm. 1 claw disrupts, the 2nd overwhelms, the 3rd finishes. It was precision by design, a brutal efficiency developed through dozens of coordinated strikes against vulnerable Allied formations. But this wasn't vulnerable. This wasn't predictable. This wasn't even logical. What they saw in front of them was a fortress, twisting in space, dragging its guns like rotating blades across impossible angles. One moment the waist guns covered the flanks, the next they swept forward. The top turret spat fire upward into approach paths. No B-17 was ever supposed to track. The plane should have stalled. It didn't. It should have dropped altitude. It didn't. It just kept holding the impossible bank like it had teeth and a purpose. Inside German headsets. The panic spread like flame through dry wheat. Kippt. One shouted he's tipping. He's flipping. Another barked. Winkel unmöglich. Keine Formation möglich, the angles are impossible. No formation is possible. The lead element tried to reform at 6 o'clock, expecting the tail gun to be offline. It was. But as they dove in, the right waist gun caught their movement, already sweeping its fire into the aft quarter. The second aircraft took hits to the wing root and spiraled out, trailing smoke. The third overcorrected and stalled into a shallow dive. That's when the fear broke the line. German pilots who had flown hundreds of missions started pulling off, not retreating, just hesitating. And that was worse. They weren't coordinating. They weren't timing. They were thinking. Hesitation shattered their rhythm. Every moment lost meant another angle lost. Every misalignment meant another opening closed. One pilot screamed into the mic, "Es ist eine Falle." It's a trap. He wasn't wrong. Another simply broke radio silence and said nothing, banking away, heart pounding. From the ground, Allied radar stations recorded the spike in radio traffic and speed deviations among the FW-190 squadron. Analysts assumed mechanical failure. They were wrong. What they saw was doctrine failure. No one had trained the German fighters to deal with a B-17 that didn't act like a target. They expected a wall of fire, not a rotating blade. They expected passivity, not maneuver. They expected to dictate the fight. Instead, they found themselves caught in one man's geometry, fighting not against a bomber, but against the way he shaped the sky. And in that moment, they stopped hunting and started trying to understand how they had become the prey. When the last FW-190 peeled off, Red Willow 9 was not victorious. It was surviving. The sky was empty for now, but the fortress was barely holding together. The tail section had taken multiple cannon strikes. The stabilizer was cracked along its centerline. Control cables frayed and sang against the fuselage walls with each vibration. The number 2 engine was out completely. The number 4 engine was smoking and coughing. Oil pressure dipped so low, Keller had to feather the prop to keep it from seizing. The fortress was now flying on 2 hearts, both tired. The altitude held at 12,000 feet, but only because Keller kept the aircraft in a constant shallow descent, trading sky for momentum in micro increments. The cockpit reeked of blood, fuel, sweat, and electrical smoke. In the nose compartment, Lieutenant Kersey was unconscious, face bandaged with a torn piece of oxygen mask. His jaw hung loose, but he was still breathing barely. The nose glass was gone, replaced by a jagged frame of wind and cold. The bombardier's chair was twisted sideways. Blood pooled beneath it, freezing slowly in the thin air. In the waist section, the left gunner had 2 broken ribs from slamming into the bulkhead during the roll. The right gunner's hands were blistered raw from clearing a jammed belt mid-maneuver. In the radio room, Sergeant Dugan had gone silent. Not dead, just stunned. He kept staring at the dials like they were still connected to something that mattered. He didn't speak for the next 30 minutes. Keller didn't say a word either. He focused on the horizon, on the vibration of the yoke, on the muscle memory that told him how much the airframe could take before it let go. His co-pilot had stopped arguing. The man was just holding his seat, watching the instruments, not daring to breathe too deep. The fortress didn't fly anymore. It drifted, floated, sank in slow motion toward the Italian coast. No one cheered. No one radioed command. The antenna was gone. They were ghosts now. Fuel was low. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. Flaps were unresponsive. Keller eyed an auxiliary airfield near Corsica, only 800 meters of usable runway and no proper landing pattern. The gear system was partially damaged. Only one leg extended on command. Rather than risk asymmetrical contact, Keller made the decision to belly land. He circled once, lined up manually, and brought the fortress down hard. Metal screamed. The aircraft bounced once, slid sideways, and came to a stop in a shower of dust and sparks. Silence followed. The crew began to stir. They moved like survivors, not victors. A jeep approached from the airfield shack, its driver pale at the sight of the mangled war machine sitting crooked in the grass. One of the medics asked if they'd been hit by a rocket. Another asked if they had downed escort. They said nothing. No one on that airstrip understood what had just happened. And even if they had, they wouldn't have believed that the fortress should have come back at all. They carried Lieutenant Kersey out first, still breathing through a field dressing soaked in blood. 2 medics slid him onto a stretcher, and sprinted toward the aid station without waiting for questions. The rest of the crew exited the wreck in fragments. One man limped, another was pulled. The left waist gunner staggered 3 steps, vomited into the grass, then collapsed onto his knees. The right gunner walked straight ahead like he was still in the sky, eyes locked on something invisible in front of him. No one saluted, no one debriefed. The base crew just stared at the battered fortress, its skin peeled back in places, bullet holes overlapping like handwriting, half its control surfaces frozen in strange angles. One of the mechanics muttered, "This thing flew in like that Keller climbed down last. No rush, no drama." He dropped from the hatch, landed hard, stood up slowly. The moment his boots hit the dirt, a flight officer from the tower jogged over, out of breath, holding a clipboard and stammering questions. "What happened to the rest of the group? Where's your escort? Were you bounced by a flak trap or fighters? Did you deviate from route?" Keller didn't answer. He just stared at the sky like it owed him something. The officer tried again, this time sharper. "Captain, you need to provide a preliminary statement. We have no record of Keller cut him off with a flat voice. 14 fighters, no escort, improvised defense." And that was all he said. Later, in the briefing hut, the crew sat around a dented metal table while 2 intelligence officers reviewed a sketch of the enemy formation drawn from their collective memory. The questions came slow at first, then faster. "You're saying you rolled the aircraft to what degree? 55. How many fighters confirmed down? Why didn't you descend? Why didn't you radio for help? What formation defense did you employ one by one?" The crew looked at each other, then at Keller. No one spoke. Finally, the co-pilot leaned forward and said, "He rolled it." Silence. Then one of the officers frowned. "He what?" The co-pilot clarified. "He rolled the fortress into a convergence angle, made the waist guns overlap, held the bank, used geometry." The officers blinked, not understanding. The pilot on duty laughed once under his breath and muttered, "He's lucky he didn't tear the wings off." The waist gunner answered without looking up, "Yeah, that's what I thought too." When the after-action report was finally filed, the language was cautious. It acknowledged non-standard maneuver under duress, unorthodox gun convergence during rolling engagement, and possible violation of structural bank limits. The final line read, "Survivability achieved through unapproved but effective application of overlapping fire arcs." There was no medal, no citation, no commendation. But among the ground crews and pilots who read the report, the story moved faster than paper. They began calling the maneuver Keller's tilt. Nobody said it out loud in front of command, but pilots started asking quiet questions. Could you do it in a B-24? Would the wings hold in a dive roll? Could the waist guns overlap on purpose? Could you fake weakness long enough to make them come in wrong? They didn't talk about heroism. They talked about timing, and they all agreed on one thing. Whoever flew Red Willow 9 that day didn't win the fight. He rewrote it. No one added Keller's name to any training manual. No film strip was made. No chalkboard diagram labeled Keller's tilt ever appeared in official bomber school lectures. But the story moved anyway. It passed through debriefings like a rumor wearing a flight jacket. Crews began to murmur about the waist gun convergence theory. Gunners swapped ideas about roll-angle fire alignment. Pilots questioned the old limits, not loudly, not in front of inspectors. But the questions multiplied. They always do when a rule breaks and no one dies. By mid-1944, 3 different B-24 crews had attempted mild roll convergence during fighter breaks over Hungary. 2 succeeded in confusing the attack pattern. 1 cracked a wing spar and barely made it home. The official line remained clear banking past 30 degrees in a loaded bomber was not advised, but the unofficial language changed. Instructors began using phrases like situational flexibility, rolling arc manipulation, and bank defense staging. They never said Keller's name, but they started teaching his shape. One gunnery sergeant at Amendola Field drew the diagram on a chalkboard. pretending it was theoretical. Two waist gunners recognized it immediately. One had been there the day Red Willow 9 landed sideways. He didn't correct the instructor. He just nodded. Back in the States, flight simulation officers at Keesler Field conducted unofficial experiments using mock cockpits. They tested if overlapping arcs could be achieved without full roll. They failed. Then they tried again with a 35-degree bank and dual gunnery rotation. It worked for 10 seconds before the simulator frame locked up. Still, the numbers made it to Washington in a footnote. Nothing came of it. But footnotes have a way of sticking. Somewhere over the Ruhr in late October, a B-17 crew engaged in what was described as a lateral defensive weave that overlapped waist gun fire across an oblique angle. The pilot claimed he was adjusting for drag imbalance. The gunner called it Kellering. They were not disciplined. In November, a short memo circulated among the 301st Bomb Group gunners are advised to be aware of temporary arc convergence during adverse roll conditions. Synchronization of side fire may prove tactically useful. Coordination is advised. It was unsigned. The language was vague, but every man who read it understood what it meant. The doctrine didn't officially shift. It bent. The Army Air Forces couldn't endorse a maneuver that violated the airframe's structural envelope, but they couldn't deny the results either. So they stopped saying don't and started saying only if you have to. That was enough. What Keller introduced wasn't a tactic. It was a challenge to the sacred idea that bombers had to be passive, predictable, and obedient to their formation. That defense meant staying inside the lines. He proved that in chaos, shape mattered more than speed, that geometry could be weaponized, that sometimes breaking formation didn't mean breaking faith. It meant creating an outcome no one had imagined before. In later years, when fighter doctrine shifted toward energy maneuvering, when dogfights became dances of momentum and angle instead of just speed and altitude, a few instructors traced that thinking back to a strange event in 1944. They couldn't name it. They had no film, no diagrams. But they had heard the story of a B-17 that rolled sideways into death and came out the other side still flying. That wasn't something you taught. That was something you passed on. Red Willow 9 never flew again. The damage to her wings, fuselage, and engine mounts was too extensive. Her left elevator was twisted beyond salvage. The right gear strut had punched through the wheel well on belly landing. Her tail section flexed visibly every time a mechanic walked near it. She sat at the edge of the Corsican field for 2 weeks, tarped and silent, her skin flaking in the wind. Then came the salvage crew. They stripped her clean guns, radios, instrumentation, even the battered bomb sight that had survived the nose hit. When they were done, she was just a husk of rivets and memory. They cut her wings off with torches and dragged the remains behind the fuel depot. No ceremony, no photographs, just the quiet ending of a machine that had done more than it was ever meant to. Oh, Frank Keller didn't stay on Corsica. He flew 2 more missions in borrowed aircraft before the higher-ups grounded him for medical observation. Not because of physical injury, but because the report flagged him as a possible operational deviation risk. They didn't use the word unstable, but they didn't have to. After 31 combat flights, Keller was reassigned to a stateside training unit. He didn't protest. He packed a single duffel bag and left without goodbye. No one at the training field knew who he was. He never mentioned Red Willow 9. He never spoke about the role. He taught formation flight and emergency descent theory. He ran gunnery simulations. He kept his tone measured, professional, distant. A few pilots remembered him as courteous but unreadable. He answered questions with questions. He praised creativity but punished recklessness. And one day, without notice, he was gone. Discharged in early 45, no record of post-war employment, no interviews, no memoir. His military file ends with a single line typed in fading ink. Separated honorably, no further service required. His name vanished from rosters. His photo never appeared in squadron frames. But his story didn't disappear. Across several air bases in the final year of the war, a strange ritual emerged. Crews would tape a small, hand-drawn triangle near the waist gun positions of their B-17s, sometimes with a sharp arrow curving across it. No words, just shape, a reminder, not regulation, not authorized, but always respected. One surviving photo from Amendola Field shows such a mark on the side of a battered bomber named Drift Widow. The crew refused to explain it. A gunner only said, "We fly crooked when we need to." That was enough. Years later, when war simulation engineers at Wright-Patterson were reviewing unconventional flight data for digital training programs, one set of logs stood out. A 55-degree bank maintained under asymmetrical thrust, resulting in forward overlapping fire arcs. They had no footage, no confirmation, just one entry tagged with 3 words, "Rollover defense successful." That log became part of a classified simulation series, then a test program, then a concept. By the time bombers became machines without gunners, the need for such a maneuver vanished. But the idea didn't. It lived on in doctrine that favored unpredictability, in pilot training that taught angles over aggression, and in quiet conversations between instructors who knew when rules had to bend to save lives. Frank Keller disappeared. The fortress didn't. The day she tilted into fire and refused to die, she stopped being just a machine. She became geometry with intent. And long after the man was gone, the shape he left behind still flew.